Today, I'd like to talk about immigration and acculturation. What does it look like? How does it happen when a person joins a new culture? The first thing we have to talk about is enculturation. Enculturation is that process by which an individual learns about his or her own culture. It's the process where a child learns about its own culture and adopts it, and then becomes a fully functioning member of this culture. So you'll see to the left here, I have a picture of what looks like it could be a grandfather fishing with a granddaughter. This is how enculturation works. It is passed in the culture is passed intergenerationally, and young folks learn from the older folks, and you become a full and accepted member of that culture. Enculturation is necessary for survival. You cannot survive if you don't have a culture. It happens within the family. Learning the family's home language is one of the main ways this happens, and also learning customs that go along with that family's home culture. And education is also a major force in enculturation. If you send a child to school for 12 years, that child learns not only some facts and figures, but learns how to interact with people, learns what a culture finds important and what a culture finds is not important, and learns the values of that culture through schooling. Acculturation, however, is the process of cultural and psychological change that happens between cultural groups uh, and their individual members when they come in contact with each other. It takes place in both groups and in all individuals in contact. Although one group is usually dominant over the others, so in our scenario, it would be um, US American culture being dominant over the culture of immigrants. Successful outcomes require mutual accommodation among all groups and individuals who are living together. So there can be no successful acculturation process if immigrants are not welcomed into the society and are given the tools that they need in order to acculturate. Acculturation leads to changes in cultural practices. And remember, cultural practices and products are above the waterline and can relatively easily be changed. But it becomes much more difficult if there are differences in cultural perspectives. Those are the values beneath the waterline that it becomes really difficult to change. And acculturation does not necessarily lead to acceptance as a full member of the in group. This is not in any way related to how much an immigrant, in this case, tries to take on the qualities that the dominant culture finds important. It is rather how accepting of that immigrant is the dominant culture. So you need to think a little bit about acculturation and enculturation. The process is going to be different for each person. So if you think of a baby born into a culture, that baby comes without a previous culture. Think of a 5 year old growing up in a new culture. So that 5 year old had the start in a new culture and has parents who are immersed in that culture. A 35-year-old is a fully functioning individual who is fully capable in his or her own um, culture, now coming into a new one. A 65-year-old is somebody who has lived an entire life in a culture and now has to, in some way, come to terms with the culture that they have moved into. So the process will be different for each one of these people. Um, let's look at a little bit about the differences between acculturation and enculturation. I'm not going to go through this chart in detail, but you should feel free to stop the video here and read it in more detail. It's important to know the difference between acculturation and enculturation and how those things work. So I encourage you to stop and read this a little bit. So, acculturation is the process of learning and adopting from someone else's culture. Enculturation is the process of learning and adapting your own culture. Acculturation is the process by which my own culture becomes subsumed by another. So my culture is still there, but there's a layer on top of it that is the new culture. Whereas with enculturation, I don't have another culture underneath. Acculturation is not essential for survival, but you learn it when it is necessary. So, and you take that of your new culture that you find necessary in order to survive in the new culture. And you don't take what you don't need. Whereas without enculturation, you cannot survive. Acculturation, if you go for a long period of time, may lead to assimilation, which is when one completely gives up one's own culture and takes on the new one. Whereas with enculturation, there is no problem with that because there is no other culture. Acculturation usually doesn't provide the acceptance and distinct identity as a fully functioning member of the in group, whereas enculturation is how a person becomes part of that in group. It's also probably important that acculturation includes a motive or a goal. You immigrate for a reason, and in order to reach that goal, you take on the new culture. Whereas enculturation just simply happens. There's no reason that one goes into it. And finally, acculturation is something that often happens to those who are far from home, who are not in their native country, who are not necessarily surrounded by people who are like them or who can help them. Whereas enculturation is the thing that happens with the people who are closest to you. It happens while you are in the environment that you were born into. So it's important to keep those differences in mind of how a person takes on a second culture or a third or fourth culture and how you get your first one. Acculturation is a consequence of immigration or migration. Remember, migration is when you go to another culture with a limited amount of time in mind. You intend to go back to your original culture. So, acculturation takes a long time. You actually start this before you even begin your immigration or migration journey, especially if the immigration is planned, orderly, and well financed. It's possible for you to begin to identify with the new culture immediately, even before you leave your home culture. This is the case if somebody these days is immigrating from Europe. European immigrants are, generally speaking, able to plan and finance their immigration journeys. But if you are not coming from a background that where you have a lot of resources, or if you are a refugee, you will not have a planned or orderly journey to the United States. So it's going to be different depending on your status. The process of acculturation is much faster if the two cultures share a language. It's also faster if the languages are closer, even if they are not the same. But the more different that the languages are, the more difficult acculturation becomes. And the process is also faster if the home culture and the host culture share cultural perspectives. Because remember, it's the perspectives that have to change in enculturation. And you also need to remember that most immigrants do not come from a culture that is like US culture. So, when we talk about the experience of immigration or migration, there are several phases that we can talk to. The first one would be pre migration. Immigrants might be living in poverty or violent areas or in areas where they're politically repressed in their home cultures. And this daily life will shape their expectations of the new culture. They may idealize the new culture because it's not going to be the way that it is at home. Some immigrants are already traumatized by their experiences in their home culture, and this experience of trauma does not go away after a person arrives in the new culture. Many immigrants have only felt secure and emotionally supported within their families, but going to a new culture means leaving behind those people with whom one had a secure environment. So that only increases the anxiety. Other immigrants, a large number of immigrants, however, are from middle class or upper class backgrounds. And that means that immigration to the United States or anywhere else might mean a step downwards for these people. Their lives may be more insecure than they were in their former culture. This is the case, for example, in Germany with immigrants from Syria who came from professional backgrounds in Syria but whose educational accomplishments are not recognized in Germany. So you may have been a physician in Syria, and in Germany, you're working on a production line. The actual experience of immigration or migration will also be different. Taking leave of your family or friends is always the beginning of the migration or immigration. So you're leaving behind that world that you knew and you're heading out into the unknown. The migration itself may be extremely dangerous, and that may add to the trauma. So if you walked from Syria to Europe, you went through some experiences that could very well have been extremely traumatic to you. And then for the United States, gaining entry into the United States could be either easy or difficult, depending on the circumstances of your immigration. But interacting with authorities is always daunting. You never know what's going to happen when you speak to an authority. And finally, there's the post-migration experience. So, what happens when an immigrant is suddenly confronted with the reality of immigration? You've idealized this culture as a place better than you were before, but you may find when you arrive that the opportunity to realize your dreams is going to be much harder than you thought it was going to be. You may have to acquire values that are in conflict with the values of your home culture. You may have to learn a new language. You may face stereotype and discrimination. People may look at you as a member of a national group or an ethnic group, and instead of looking at you as the individual that you are, you may be isolated, especially if you've entered the country without a valid visa, or you overstayed your visa, or you are in the asylum process and it's unable to find out what's going on. It's really a good idea not to call attention to yourself. So you stay home and don't do anything. So immigration and acculturation are difficult. In the popular imagination, once the immigrant arrives in the US, the problems are over. This seems to be what the larger group of US Americans thinks. The immigrants have come here now, and everything here is so much better than where they were before that they should get over it and just be grateful for living in the United States. But it's much more difficult than that makes that sound. It's much more difficult than many people realize. And that's because acculturation requires not only changes in products and practices, but in perspectives as well. So we're going to be looking at more closely this process of acculturation. And that's going to be in the next two videos.